Hour today. Before we get started, I just want to take a few minutes to orient you to the WebEx system. For this call, because we have a number of participants who will be joining us, we will have you on mute, but this is a call to really talk with Jane, our expert around these things, and so around sensory modulation and all of the information that she presented last week. And so in order to field some of the questions, we're going to ask that you please chat your question in today. Just because there's so many people, we're unable to open up the line. And so if you could do that, if you're having any technical difficulties, please chat to our host, Brianna, who will be able to assist you with any issues that you may have. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. And again, as I said, welcome to the Sensory Connection Series Power Hour. Today, Jane Musgrave will be joining us to really talk with us around sensory modulation techniques for calming, coping, and creating sensory soothing environments. Jade presented a webinar last week that really kind of went through, and she will do an overview of all of the techniques that she discussed. And then what we're going to do is open it up for you guys to ask Jane any questions that you may have relative to the information that was presented, and perhaps maybe just some more clarification around techniques that were discussed. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to Jane.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you for attending, and if you've come back for the second session, thank you so much for returning. What I was asked to do is to go over sort of just a brief summary of what we talked about last week. And then we did get some questions, but I'd love to hear your questions. I do want to start with and I had an old supervisor who used to call this buying insurance beforehand and say, I honestly do not know all the answer to the mysteries of life in the world. So there's certainly maybe topics or questions that you ask that I will want to do a little research on, or certainly possibly even incorporate into next week's workshop. And also to invite anyone who might be in the audience, if you have some interesting input or additional information that you want to kind of add to that question, please feel free. I am a huge believer in what I call sort of cooperative learning, and that we learn more as a group than we do certainly from one individual. So I invite you to be part of this webinar. All right, so let's get started. If you were here last week, and you remember what we sort of talked about, started with, is the idea that this is kind of a new direction in mental health services. And it really started from the initiative that was sent out by SAMHSA to significantly reduce, and that was the word they used, reduce, I like to say prevent restraint and seclusion, because people are getting hurt. Clients are getting hurt, children getting hurt, adults who may have to engage in this sort of what's, I guess, called a crisis intervention, we're getting hurt, as well as staff. And it really is a re-traumatizing event, or actually kind of creating this idea of being a treatment into a trauma experience. And we like to put the treat back in treatment. What we found is the idea of preventing restraint and seclusion is that if we can teach somebody to self-soothe, or what are those techniques, then we can actually not have that even be something that needs to be considered. We talked about the 7 senses, and those are the first 5. We have the hearing, our seeing, our smelling, our tasting, and touch. And we talked about the 3 additional that unless you're really sort of an occupational therapist or you have a degree specifically in sort of the rehabilitative therapies or medicine, nursing, you probably didn't learn so much. And these are things such as proprioception, which is our orientation in space, where our body is in space. That helps us know where, you know, if we're sitting or standing up, where the ground is. I use the example, if we jump in a pool and you need to find where up is, you instinctually know this because of the receptors in your joints that feel Earth's gravitational pull, so that you don't have to think about where up is. Our bodies just kind of know. We also talked about balance or vestibular system, and how that actually helps with us feeling sort of content in where we are, kind of its cousin to proprioception, but where we are And I use the example, if you ever have a dream that you feel like you trip, we kind of have this startle response. Or if you actually do trip, there's that sort of initial rush of adrenaline goes through you as you try and catch yourself. Feeling grounded and focused and balanced can be very helpful for feeling comfortable within our own bodies. And then the last one, interoception, which is the real sense of the internal sense of your internal organs. And that's that idea of, do I know when I'm hungry? And then my behavior is to eat. If I'm cold, I put a sweater on. Someone used to say you put a sweater on when your mother's cold. But this is really our own internal body recognizing that we have a certain need. I find a lot of times some of the kids I'm working with will have some real challenges with this area. And that's where we get into some of those things like, not knowing enough I've got to go to the bathroom. I feel the need that I have to go to the bathroom so I can time it well enough to get myself to the bathroom. Or I'm full and I shouldn't keep eating, but I keep eating until I literally become ill from it. So, and then we also talked about the mysterious ninth sense, and I'm hoping that someone will remember this if you were here last week, and that is common sense. For any of these techniques, for any of the interventions we're going to talk about today, with even some of the questions, and certainly as we go into more specific details about certain techniques that you can use in next week's workshop, common sense is very important. So, and I think I gave the example of I had a clinician who had a lovely golden retriever who was about 90 pounds, and I walked around the corner and the 90-pound golden retriever is crawling in the 90-pound, 90-year-old, and I'm like, this is not good. Maybe weight, but it's not a good use of weight at this moment. Okay. We also talked about the just right balance, and this is one of the things I said, if you leave with nothing else last week, if this was the one thing you could leave with, and that is that idea of that there is a just right balance when the person is both calm and alert. This is where self-awareness is most easily to access, where learning can take place. The person's going to appear content, relaxed, engaged, and attentive. My secret hope to all of you right now is that you are in that place. You have found a nice, calm environment to be able to watch the webinar, but are also engaged and attentive and feel you're in a place where you can learn something. All right, and we called that the Goldilocks sort of state, the arousal state. You're not too high, you're not too low, but you're just right. We talked about arousal states. There is low arousal. The low arousal person appears sluggish and slouched. They're withdrawn. They're socially withdrawn. They're withdrawn even from the engagement, of the people next to them, as well as their sort of whole social sphere. They don't really want to go to programming. They may not want to go to school. They may not want to go to group programs or any of those kinds of things. They tend to like to stay in bed or really kind of keep a low even visually. They may have their head down. They're not receiving as much sensory input from their environment. They can be flat, sad, or poorly focused. We talked a little bit how the environment, which is the sensory stimulus around us, has a huge impact on this. And you really need to go, and back when I said I think I gave you guys homework last week, was to go back and look at your environment. What are the sensory temperature check you would take of that? If you're the Martha Stewart of mental health and you walk in that agency you work at or that residential facility or even in the home where you might be seeing kids, what does it smell like? What does it look like? How much light is going on? What's the temperature? Does it feel engaging? Do you want to engage in that environment? Or is there something about that environment that really makes you want to back off? I think I mentioned last week I do a lot of work with even adolescent residential programs, and one of the first things I do is, how does this place smell? If I'm walking in the door here, I'm a parent and I'm dropping my kid off, does it smell inviting? Does it look inviting? We talked about limited variety as the rules and regs or the culture of our facilities or our agencies. Are we being sure that we are limiting what we absolutely need to, and not just because we've done it for this way for so long, or this is kind of the culture. So, everyone, we always have just this food this day, this food that day, this food that day. Do we actually allow for some control that the people who are in that program can control what makes sense to and allow some variety? And then we talked about high arousal. And the real difference with the high arousal and the low arousal is the low arousal client or child or adult sometimes doesn't get a lot of our attention because it's not necessarily what we feel is a crisis. The high arousal person tends to be more that energy that you can feel and you immediately go, we need to do something here. This really will require some kind of intervention on our part to make sure that this stays safe. Those people tend to be poorly focused. They're very hyperactive. They're intrusive. We talked about Up, the movie Up and Doug the Talking Dog, and that not everyone who has this high arousal is in crisis or dysregulated. It may just be their general energy level. They tend to be tense in posture. You'll see a lot of pacing going on, and they're having a real difficulty concentrating or task or conversation. I say that with this kind of person, you feel it right in your gut. You kind of know, you can feel that energy that's going on. Then we went over sensory overload, and there were some questions about that, so hopefully I can address that a little bit more. I did answer them some last week, and that is when you literally are almost at the boiling point, and you kind of shut down. I think of it almost as our psychological circuit breaker. So you've gotten to the point that if one more thing happens, you are going to become completely dysregulated, but you're almost in this numb state. You could almost call it a fugue, or almost not quite dissociative, but it's sort of like this, I can't do any more. I am feeling so overwhelmed here, and knowing that if you see somebody, if you're coming in, say it's your shift, or you haven't seen them for a while, or the child's just coming home from school, and you see this, it may be low arousal because it might look that way, but it could be sensory overload. And that's that idea of calming somebody first, and if they go, nope, everything's fine, I'm bored out of my mind, this is so boring, there's nothing to do, that's when you can do some more alerting things. We talked about calming, what calming has in common. It's mild, it's soft, it's predictable, rhythmic, it's simple and familiar. And we talked about alerting. And alerting activities are strong and pronounced, or alerting stimulus, fast-paced. It doesn't have a rhythm. You can't predict what's going to be happening next. It's complex, and it's new and surprising. And what we did last time was we went over each of those 8 senses, not the 9th one, common, although I have to think about that. But we went over each of those and what would specifically be activities that were calming and alerting in those areas. So, having said that, let's start thinking about some questions. And again, the last slide here is this concept and the idea of if you see behavior, really think first, could this be a sensory processing issue? Is it always behavioral? Yes, some things are behavioral, but there could be some sensory processing either interwoven within it, or it could be a true, just full-fledged sensory processing issue. So, does anyone have any questions?
So, Jane, while we wait for people to chat in some of the questions that they may have, I know last week there were questions related to being able to do some of these techniques in like a home-like environment. Can you speak to that? And sure. What types of things can you help families kind of learn so as they, perhaps as children transition back home from longer-term placement, but how they can help these kids regulate themselves in their home environment?
Sure. Actually, I do a lot with this, and what I'll do is I actually do work with the parents as well as even see the child's bedroom, see the environment in the home, and how can we bring tools and model some of these kinds of behaviors and these kind of utilizing these tools for the kids that we're working with or the parents working with their child. Some examples are, I love to find out, first of all, from any kind of way that we've learned, what are the sensory systems that the child really gravitates to. So an example that I had was a young man who was having he was about 8 years old. He was on the autism spectrum, and he really had a hard time sort of sitting still and actually participating in any kind of family dynamic. So what we started doing is looking at the family room, and we added a basket of sensory tools right next to the couch. We got a nice kind of wicker basket and added some of the squish ball toys, and we had made a weight weighted medicine ball that we covered in some fun duct tape. We added that in. And this young man really liked pillows, so what we did was we put pillows on the family couch, and we weighted them. And we actually added some lavender because that was one of his favorite scents, so that it became, the sensory pieces became part of the normalized environment within the home. Other things I've done, recently I had a young girl who really gravitates again towards the weighted blanket. She had one that had gotten too small and too light, so we brought that downstairs, and I had Mom start using that with herself while her daughter could bring her weighted blanket down. They'd watch TV together. And then the weighted blanket could also be upstairs at nighttime. So, and really look at kind of the parent doing some of these activities within the home. If I had my way, every home would have rocking chairs. Rocking chairs would be available for all. Another way, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the workshop next week, is even setting up, particularly with younger kids in the ages of, like 4 through 12, you can even make sensory tools together. There's some wonderful recipes like how to make scented homemade Play-Doh, how to do a stress bottle, and hopefully next week we're going to be able to access a video that I have that's made by kids specifically on breathing exercises and calming down and using the sensory bottle. So again, bringing some of those kind of ideas in. We've had how to make your own, it's called the moon, it's not moon putty, moon sand. So there are lots of fun, easy, and very inexpensive ways that you can create some of these techniques. One of the things about this is that you don't want to be doing this only when the child is looking like they're becoming dysregulated. You really want to start seeking and thinking out what is it that the child gravitates and likes, and really help them build kind of an awareness of this so that they then can kind of know to use it if they are becoming dysregulated. You just don't wait and say, okay, you're dysregulated, here's your weighted blanket. You start using some of these tools ahead of time, even when the child is regulated, with the idea of really incorporating this into their lives. Did that help at all?
It did, thank you. And I do have a question. So this question comes from Amy, who says she works with clients who have a history of trauma and sometimes experience dissociative response. Yep. Should this be handled with calming techniques to relieve the stress or anxiety leading to the trauma response, or arousing techniques to help them reconnect with the present and reality?
Unfortunately, it's kind of both, because it matters on the individual. And I would say that the one thing about individuals also who have had trauma is we find that when we do those sensory profiles that I talked about last time, the evaluations, you'll almost see a contradiction in the profile where somebody is an avoider, that there's certain things they absolutely can't be near or kind of be responded to or leave. They don't like that stimulus, that trigger. And then they also sort of seek. And you think, wow, if someone's an avoider, how can they be a seeker? So that's where, particularly in those kind of environments, an evaluation is very helpful, or really sitting down and asking the person, what do you do to calm down? What does help? Dissociative, as a general rule, you try and do alerting techniques. You try and bring the person back into the here and now, particularly if there's any self-injurious behavior involved in it. And I talked a little bit last time, and I don't know if you were present, but regarding the idea of the woman that I had, a young lady, actually she was about 18, that was engaging in some significant self-injurious behavior that required, definitely medical treatment, and at one time hospitalization. And she was having the hardest time, after taking her PR and waiting for it to take effect. And we used very, very strong alerting techniques to bring her back to the present and not really sort of dissociate or be in that past traumatic event. Then there are times when she would just become sort of anxious and sort of dysregulated and all upset about things, and that's when we would use some calming techniques. So I would say, again, it sort of depends on the person. All of us in our life will have needs to be calmer and be more alert. Those are the natural cadences of our day. So it's not only calming that we'll only use with these people. There certainly are alerting. And you kind of test it out a little bit. The nice thing about these techniques is it's a no harm, no foul. If you didn't like the weighted blanket, It didn't work. It's not that it hurt anything. So you can really sort of try out the different techniques and really ask the person, how do you feel with that? Does that alert you? Do you feel calm about that? Is that comfortable? Would you want to try that again? Or do you go, oh, no, I didn't like that one at all. So while I wish I had an absolute clear answer to you, I always believe that treatment is individualized. So this kind of follows that same rule of thought. But the person will instinctually kind of guide you in the right direction. As you work with them, you'll see what's working and you'll see what doesn't work. Did that help?
All right, then thank you. While we're waiting for some other questions to come in, I know there was a question around implementing these techniques in group settings, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I love this part because one of the things I did when I was the director of rehabilitation in our hospital, we made sure that we had a sensory group happen. At least it was like 3 times a week, and then I actually felt there should be one in every unit every day. The neat way of doing it in a group is really doing not all that different of what I've just done with you. And there actually are groups called sensibility groups and sensory awareness groups. Karen Moore, in the references I gave last week, has a wonderful book that kind of really goes through all the different kinds of groups and ways you can bring this into a group program with real guidelines of exactly how you set the group up, what materials you need, and those kind of things. And I highly recommend, I think it's called Sensory Connections, highly recommend that you check out that Karen Moore's, she has like a manual, and then she has all these wonderful handouts that you can give for groups. When I do in a group, I usually think about one of 2 things. Either am I going to focus in on one particular sense, like I might do the sense of scent, and I would start off with a what calms you, what alerts you kind of conversation and go around in the group. And then I'll probably have some different kinds of scents available. I use something called Badger Bombs, which you'll see next week. I also, anytime I find just a great hand lotion, I will gravitate and buy a couple of little packets of it. I must confess, in all my travels across the country, I've stayed at hotels, and I'm that one who's taking all those little hand lotions home with them every time I stay in a hotel. But I've also found that some people don't like the fragrance of those things, but they actually would like the scent of, say, suntan lotion or sunscreen. And I'll do a relaxation technique with breathing and with the scents. We'll end that way, and then we'll have an experiential. How did that feel for you? Did you like that? Is that something you try again? I usually hand out some handouts with that. Another group that I do is mindfulness eating. So I'm bringing kind of some of those cognitive behavioral therapy techniques of mindfulness or even DBT mindfulness into this through the senses. So I will hand out frozen orange slices to people and maybe a cracker, and I will have people basically look at the food. What does the food smell like? What does it feel like when you pick it up? And I love frozen oranges because that's a very alerting technique, or lemons are another one. Frozen melon balls is another good one. And then people will actually eat the item if they want to. They don't have to if they want to. And we talk about what were you thinking about when this happened. And you find the group really will just talk about the food. So they'll be in the moment with that item. They're practicing mindfulness, but they're using their sensory systems to do it. And then we'll talk about a couple other group ideas in the workshop in more detail next week as well.
Great, thanks. All right, so we have a question that came in. It says, we've been focusing on alerting techniques and those seem to help, but she just wanted to double check that she was on the right track. But she just wanted to thank you for answering her questions around versus the alerting or other response, so thank you.
And again, if there are other alerting and I don't know, I apologize, I sort of talk off the cuff, so I cannot remember exactly which ones I gave last week, so if I'm being a little repetitious, I apologize. But there are alerting techniques which definitely the taste is a strong one because of all the neurology we have right kind of in our mouth and our breathing. When we taste something, we also smell it. There's usually kind of a texture or tactile feature of putting something in your mouth and feeling that there. But some other great ones too for alerting are a frozen hand towel or washcloth that you put in the freezer and you make someone have to stretch it out. And that whole act of stretching out this frozen washcloth, and then they can put it on their face or the back of the neck afterwards. People having the wireless earphones. With work I do in the hospitals, a lot of times people will say, oh my goodness, could that sensory tool be, a safety issue? And being creative about ways to make sure that these are available for folks where, the unit policies will still kind of have them in there. And I found wireless headphones can be very helpful in that way, or even Bluetooth speakers that could be in a sensory room that then say the iPod or whatever is in the nurse's station that would still allow for sound and things to come in. And I guess with the other piece of that is, remember, we are multisensory beings, so we don't have to use just one sense at one time. It may be that you want to do the washcloth thing, but also dip the washcloth in a little bit of lavender oil. So there's a scent that's also being released as they're pulling this thing apart. So, or even some music, open it up to the music. Kind of, if you want for alerting, you might want to have some music with a strong beat and a rhythm to it, where the strong beat can be alerting, but the rhythm and that repetition of the rhythm actually facilitates some of that calming piece.
Great. And so, Jane, can you talk a little bit about, I would imagine that when working with the children in particular, who have some of these sensory things going on and you're working a plan with them, can you talk a little bit about how you work with like a school per se to kind of incorporate some of these techniques throughout the day? Like in particular, if you had a child who, just say you're working with them in the community and they have these issues and working in OT and has some strategies to use, how do you help schools recognize or give them the ability to kind of incorporate some of those tools throughout their day?
That's a good question, because sometimes it's a little bit challenging, and I have to say it really depends on the school and how much their familiarity is with these kinds of things. Some schools have OTs that are absolutely built really within their system. Some have more consulting OTs who come, for an hour a week, or really feel, they're doing more traditional school-based OT. And if there are any school-based OTs out there, I'd love to hear from you, because this is where I actually want to be working and kind of growing in my knowledge base. A lot of times, and when I worked in the school system many, many years ago, I'm thinking my son was just born, so it was 27 years ago when I worked in the school system, but OT was very much referred to for real sensory motorical kind of things, or motor pathways, those handwriting, that kind of stuff. And this whole idea of sensory modulation is really kind of that new frontier bringing into the school. I've taken the road of, when I write up, evaluations and I make recommendations, I really sort of call it almost like prescriptions from the occupational therapist, that making sure, looking at the child's, say, schedule at school, and are you constantly asking the child to do, all these sort of task-focused activities with no break for some movement or pattern repetitive movement, which again we'll talk about next week, but so that they can actually balance their sensory day, so that they can do something that helps regulate them and then have to sit down for a task-focused behavior. So, and then maybe get up and have recess or those kind of things, how you balance out those basically sensory requirements. Because what happens is kids are using so much energy to kind of be focused, particularly if they're having problems in this area. And if you have math, and then you have English, and then you have social studies, you're asking an awful lot for a child who really needs to engage in some sensory pattern movement for calming down, so that they can actually sit and focus afterwards. So we look at the schedule. We also look at tools. I have a couple of kids who really find that, their iPad, but the iPod, the music, or those kind of things are very helpful, but then the school may say, absolutely not, this is not used here. So we look at, okay, if it's not able to be used, where could we build it in that it would be acceptable? If it was okay to take it to the resource room, how could we do that? How can we really help incorporate and weave this into part of their day, because we're saying that these kids should be doing some of these things, and the rule is kind of at minimum at least 3 times a day, if not just to help with the continuous regulation. So working with school systems, I would say the best success I have is when I'll actually physically go to some of the IEP meetings, bring in the eval that I have, meet with the team and meet with the parents who I've usually been working with before, and really sort of together negotiate and carve out what's going to still work with the school environment and the school culture, as well as support the child.
Great, thank you. So I just want to remind folks that we are taking questions, and if you have a question, if you could just chat that in the chat box, and we'll make sure to respond to that. We'd love to hear from you guys and just understand some of the things that you want to consider with working with your population, and as well as any challenges that you think may present themselves in utilizing some of these techniques. So we are definitely looking forward to hearing from you.
There is one question that we received that on the list that I'd be glad to address while we're waiting for some more questions from the audience, and that is the one on sensory techniques for adults. I know there are some people out there who are working with adults, and the question reads, for sensory techniques for adults with chronic psychiatric disorders, particularly how a multi-sensory room can best be utilized. One of the things that I have done a lot in my consultation business is help facilities, particularly hospitals, design sensory rooms. In Massachusetts, it's really interesting. The Department of Mental Health, which licenses our locked psychiatric hospitals, are now requiring that these programs have a sensory room. And really, that's sort of part of the licensure survey that happens. So I would say the first thing is really looking at, yes, this is extremely helpful for that population. Again, that's where I really kind of started my work. The way that we would do it is multifaceted. So we would have groups. We would have groups in a sensory room. The way we did, because real estate is always kind of an issue in a hospital. There's only so much physical space. And originally, we tried to have a comfort room on every unit. And a sensory room that was much larger and kind of a more breadth of resources in a treatment area that all the clients at the hospital had access to, and where a lot of our programming, our group programming, happened. When you first try and bring a comfort room onto a unit, and of course every room has already been occupied, there usually isn't a lot of unused space on a unit. It's somebody's office, or it's where they store things, etc. And what we found as we started doing the groups and utilizing some of these techniques, and actually even utilizing these techniques specifically with people who had experiences of restraint. Anyone who had been restrained more than twice, we would actually suggest that a sensory evaluation be done and really look at what were some of the techniques that we could start working with that individual on for self-soothing. When staff started seeing that it actually made a difference, it was really interesting what happened with the real estate. We had one nurse manager of the unit who said that she was willing to give up her office to make it a comfort room. We had people find additional storage for other things in other places or even off the unit to be able to create these kind of spaces. We had one of the things about a comfort room is it's really mostly the calming element. I'll talk a lot more in depth about this next week. It doesn't have the alerting pieces, it has the calming pieces, because the calming pieces don't necessarily have to have staff supervision with them. I like to say you're never going to calm anyone to a coma, but you could alert somebody into a dysregulated state. So we keep the calming things, and it needs to be available 24 hours, 7 days a week, and 52 weeks a year. So you don't say to somebody, oh, you're too dysregulated to go into the calming room. You might bring them in there and help them use some of those techniques to calm. Or you don't say, I'm sorry, the calming room is only open between 12 and 1, Wednesdays and Thursdays. It's this idea that it's supposed to be a resource for people, and that means even at 2 o'clock in the morning if need be. See if I'm making sure I'm answering all the parts of the question. The multisensory room was then utilized for groups. specifically, where we would do some of those sensibility groups I was talking that Karen Moore has designed, as well as some other ones that we kind of thought of at the moment in the time, as well as individual sessions where you're working with someone who may be more regulated at that time, but they're practicing. I like to think of these things almost like learning an instrument. It really does take some practice. And remembering that when we are dysregulated, the last thing we sometimes think about is all the things we really should be doing for ourselves. So you're really building those skill sets, starting from that area and working that into being part of this person's, really they're just kind of their lifestyle. So we would do different groups there. We would do individual sessions. We actually had an interesting experience where a staff person who was very beloved by many, many people in the hospital, unfortunately lost their battle with cancer. And we opened up the sensory room that day to anyone who needed to come down and just, you know, receive some sensory soothing techniques while they were dealing with the loss of this very cared for person. And it was very interesting. We had clients from all over the hospital come, and staff came, volunteers even came. We did progressive relaxation technique groups during the day. We did a lot of lavender sachet handouts. So again, this is a human tool, not just a tool for people who are receiving services. And I kind of like to emphasize that. There are a lot of good resources out there for looking at how do you build a sensory room. That's one of the, I've actually created sort of a how to build a sensory room kit. If you're interested in more information on that, feel free to contact me, including policies that you would use, particularly in inpatient settings where some of the stipulations around safety are certainly of concern for folks. So absolutely, this is a fabulous, fabulous tool with that population.
Great. We don't seem to have any more questions coming in, although I know there were a few that maybe we can attend to from last week.
Okay. Let's see. How about, there was one here on resources for vests, etc. The weighted vest is a great tool, and I have a lot of kids who really actually enjoy their weighted vest. There are two companies that I tend to order from, and that doesn't mean that I have any, again, affiliation with these companies, but they are Southpaw and Flag House. I use the vest a lot, more so with younger kids than older kids, because there can be a little bit of a stigma issue, I think, for older kids. And when older kids, I tend to make vests or take a down vest if they really like, and we'll add weights to the placket within the vest. I also look for vests that sometimes will have these, and I don't even know how to describe it, but this is one of those things I'm using my hands to show you. But they have tabs on the side so you can tighten them around the waist a little bit, tighten it in, either a drawstring or kind of pull tabs on a D-loop to kind of tighten it in so you get pressure as well as weight. I find that I use these a lot with kids, particularly for what I call transition times. So these are something that I might recommend that mom have the child use when they're picking them up from, say, the residential program to come home for a home visit, or actually bringing them back. It might be something good for the bus, or it might be good for any of those sort of transition times that appear to be difficult for the child. And that's where you really kind of observe where the child is functioning well, and what sensory sort of stimulus is happening in the environment, and how you can capitalize on that, or what seems to be a difficult time. And a lot of times, one of the things that we're finding is those transition times, whether it be school to home, home to residence, residence to school, for even clients in a hospital setting. It could be change of shift time. We actually find that research is showing that the majority of restraints tend to happen around change of shift or the evening shift, where there are a lot of transitions, the transitions from wake to going to bed, staff changing over, and some of those kinds of things. So be creative. If you're any kind of a sewer, it's pretty easy to take a down vest and add some weights. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to make weighted bears and weighted pillows next week with some more detail. And what I'll do is I'll see if I can add a little bit of snippets of the kind of kit that I put together, which has some directions for these, and we'll go over kind of how to make them. If you were at the workshop, we'd actually make one right in front of you.
I do have one question, Jane. So the question is, when you are working with, say, staff of residential facilities or just any facilities in terms of working with children and really working on integrating these approaches, what is the hardest shift for staff to make when adopting a more sensory sensitive approach? What are they challenged with?
Some of the challenges are, and again, you know, I wish I had this slide right in front of me because I have a list of this in one of the workshops I do, so I'm going to have to do this from memory here. But am I rewarding bad behavior? I've seen people say, well, if they are becoming dysregulated and I give them this lovely, you know, fluffy thing, or I give them this fabulously weighted teddy bear, I just rewarded, you know, the behavior we're trying to decrease. And is that going to be sort of a backhanded way of sort of saying, oh, yeah, every time you do this way, then you get this lovely thing? And I say, no, we're actually, what we're doing is we're building an internal sensory response to this with the idea that over time this person's going to self-gravitate to these things when they're feeling dysregulated. Sometimes I've had questions of how do you know it's behavioral or if it's sensory. Again, I always like to say, and this is the slide that we're seeing in front of us, rule out sensory first. Again, no harm, no foul. So think about it from a sensory perspective, or a lot of times it's a little bit of both. You know, we have behavioral responses to sensory stimulus. The way that I train staff is I actually have them experience a lot of these techniques themselves. One of the nicest things about this modality, I guess I would say, is that it sells itself beautifully. So when you find yourself engaging in some guided breathing exercises with lavender cream on your arms, and you're actually doing the deep breathing, and then we ask, and how are you feeling now? You can see it within yourself, so it makes more sense to you how the senses have such a huge part of our behavioral presentation in the world. And then the last piece that I have to say, and I don't want to give away all my good stories for next week, but okay, so those be like the teaser, like, you know, news at 11 kind of thing. I have a couple of stories where literally these interventions, these modalities have prevented a restraint right in front of people's eyes. And I have to say that is probably the most powerful selling tool of this. And even one story which I'll tell next week is where I handed off a tool. I was in a place that I knew nobody. I was just doing a workshop for staff, and I handed off a tool to a staff person because it was very evident that someone was becoming dysregulated. And I stayed in the room, and they came back 7 minutes later and said, oh my gosh, you would not believe what just happened. And I said, you know what, I just might believe it. I just might. So it sells itself very well. The nice thing about weight, which is what we're going to focus in on next week, one of the three that we're going to focus in on, is that when it works right before your very eyeballs. It doesn't work with everybody, but I have to say, in my experience, it works with the majority of folks. There are certainly some people who don't like weight. But when it works, you can watch relaxation just happening right in that person's body.
Great. So there is another question around what uses do you see in an outpatient setting for having a sensory room? So do you see that as a useful tool in that setting?
Oh, absolutely. I feel everyone should have one in their home. Staff included. My son, who is now 27 and a chef in Boston, came home and looked at his room, which has now become my office, and said, Mom, it looks like a 12-year-old girl lives there. You have pillows, you have stuffed animals, you have, you know, candles. This is my office. So, yes, what I would do is certainly incorporate that into your office area, wherever it might be. I actually believe that the sensory room is only the beginning of the seed in the garden, and that we really should be creating sensory environments that are our treatment facilities. So it shouldn't just be sort of, what I want to say, confined to a room, but this could be the entire environment. And there I'm going to kind of be redundant and say putting the treat back in treatment. It's amazing the power of just your lobby as people are walking in, or your, you know, a sort of area where you're checking in for, say, outpatient. Is it sensory friendly? Is it pleasing? Does it actually support the mission and values that you're trying to accomplish, you know, for your agency or whatever it be, recovery, or certainly with adults, recovery principles could be around. You could have baskets of sensory tools next to the tables in the lobby area. I believe thoroughly that your office should be a sensory pleasing space, and I actually can show some pictures of my office at the hospital next week, where I had, the running joke was I had a, you know, Keurig machine, I had rocking chairs, I had quilts on the wall, I had a nice chair, and we would call it, you know, instead of Au Bon Pain, the restaurant, it was like Au Bon Jane. You come in and you could have a cup of herbal tea, you could have those kind of things before we engaged in the treatment session. So yes, I do feel absolutely an outpatient, and I also feel that we need to walk our talk. So if we're going to be asking our clients, our kids to sort of look at these kind of techniques, we should also be thinking about them for ourselves, because we're all human and we can all benefit from this tool.
Great. And then there's someone who is interested in understanding how to build a sensory room kit, and I understand that you'll probably talk more about that next week.
Yes, I'm going to show examples. I'll show a couple of examples from different hospitals where I've helped design the comfort rooms and the sensory rooms. We'll talk about what the difference is between a comfort room and a sensory room. Also some shopping lists that people can use, and some ways that it doesn't have to be fiscally onerous to do this. Let's go talk a little bit about kind of, you've heard sometimes what's called a sensory stim room versus a sensory room, and some of the different populations, as well as the policies. It was interesting, I consulted recently at a facility, and they had this absolutely beautiful sensory room. It was wonderful, and I said, so do you do groups in here? Do you have even, like, we have something called a bedtime transition group, which would help kids be able to settle down for the evening. I'm going to go into more detail about that next time. And they went, oh, no, no, no. If a kid's not regulated, they can't come in this room. The equipment's too expensive. It's like, well, we need to think about that. We think about how we can make sure that these techniques are available for kids as a therapy tool and not as a reward. You know, this is good. You've been great all day, so you can use the sensory room. Again, the sensory room should be fun and wonderful, but it should also be, it is a therapeutic tool.
Great point. And so we have probably just a couple more minutes for some last-minute questions if anyone wants to chat them in. Otherwise, I just want to kind of sum up kind of what the Sensory Connection series, and talk about what the next two offerings, which I know, Jane, you spoke a little bit about what you'll be covering next week, but that will be held on Monday, November 9th from 12 to 1:30. Jane will give us some information around common sense for the senses and moving beyond the basics of sensory modulation, and then we will follow that up November 16th from 12 to 1 with another power hour. Again, the opportunity to speak with Jane and ask her any questions that you may have regarding the material that was presented, and anything else that she's spoken about or that you'd like to know more about.
Yep, sounds good. Again, what we'll specifically be covering next week is weight, how to make some weighted items, and creative ways of making weight. Not everybody wants a stuffed animal, and I completely understand that. So really kind of the spectrum between young children all the way up to adults utilizing that technique. We'll also talk about pattern repetitive movement and what that is, why it works, and it's interesting because sometimes I believe that our brainstem and our spinal column and our cerebellum completely understand that. It's our frontal cortex that doesn't always get it. So, and that's why you might find some people pacing, or you might find them sort of engaging in something that has this pattern movement. And at times that can also be aggressive. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We will also talk about, let me see, I said scent, weight, and scent. And how that works nanoseconds faster than our other senses, which work in nanoseconds, and also how that can be a trigger, but how it can be a wonderful portable tool for folks. Because the trick with this is you don't want to have to say, oh, great, I'm becoming dysregulated and the sensory room is across campus at the residential place I'm staying, or I'm becoming dysregulated, so maybe tonight when I go home, I get back from school, I can try some things to self-regulate. And what are some ways that we can have some portable things that are with us at all times, like breathing is a wonderful example, because I like to say that 99% of the people I know bring their lungs with them when they travel. So what are some quick techniques that you can do kind of on the spot to help with self-regulation, and also then the recognition of I am becoming dysregulated. And that can be a challenge, particularly for some people who fall in those quadrants of the profile that we looked at. We'll talk a little bit more about that too, but for some folks, it's pretty easy. They kind of can sense, I'm becoming upset, I'm getting it, I can feel it in my heart. There's a little young man in the video I hope to show next week that talks about I can feel my heart slumping. So, and the slumping goes down as I get calmer. So that how recognizing what your body does when it becomes dysregulated, so that you can start utilizing these interventions long before you really get to the point that you are completely dysregulated.
All right. Well, thank you, Jane, for the presentation. Thank you for being willing to answer questions. At this point in time, we don't have any further questions, so I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and hopefully we will see you next week for part 3 of the Sensory Connection webinar. So thank you.
Thank you.